Have you ever been in a room with someone you love and felt completely alone? Not because they left, not because they screamed at you, but because they simply stopped caring. They were right there, eating at the same table, sleeping in the same bed, breathing the same air, and yet they were gone. That invisible wall, that silence that is not peace but absence, has a name. And St. John Bosco, the priest from Turin who spent his entire life watching families fall apart from the inside, saw exactly what that wall does to a marriage. He did not just write about it in abstract theology, he witnessed it, he counseled it. He warned against it with a specificity that still cuts today. The thing Don Bosco saw destroying marriages was not infidelity, it was not poverty. It was not even cruelty in the loud, visible sense. It was indifference, the slow rot, the gradual withdrawal of attention, of warmth, of presence. The moment when a husband stops noticing his wife, the moment when a wife stops speaking to her husband about anything that matters. The day when two people decide, without ever saying a word, that the other person is no longer worth the effort. That is what Don Bosco warned about. And he did not warn gently. This story is about what he saw, what he said, what the church has always taught about this hidden poison, and why the people who heard Don Bosco's words in 19th century Turin either changed their lives or watched everything they built collapse quietly, piece by piece. If you value stories like this one, grounded in documented history and the lives of real saints, subscribe. It is the best way to support this work. And drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. We love knowing where this reaches. This script draws heavily from two sources most people have never touched. The first is Pietro Stella's 2-volume scholarly biography, Don Bosco Nella, Storia della Religiosità Cattolica, published in Turin in 1968, which tracks Don Bosco's pastoral methods through archival correspondence, the testimonies gathered during his beatification process in 1929, and records held in the Salesian archive on Via della Pisana in Rome. The second is the Memorie Biografiche di Don Giovanni Bosco, compiled by Giovanni Battista Lemoyne and continued by Eugenio Ceria across 19 volumes between 1898 and 1939. These are not popular summaries. They are primary source reconstructions. Every detail about Don Bosco's pastoral encounters with married couples, his conversations at the oratory of Valdocco, and his direct confrontations with the consequences of marital indifference come from those pages. Now back to the story. Giovanni Melchiorre Bosco was born on August 16, 1815, in the village of Becci, in the Piedmont region of northern Italy, in a farmhouse that no longer stands. His father, Francesco Bosco, died when Giovanni was not yet 2 years old, leaving his mother, Margherita Ochiena, to raise 3 boys alone on a few stony acres. That woman's life taught Don Bosco the first lesson he never forgot. A family held together by one person's love can survive nearly anything. A family abandoned by love, even slowly, even quietly, falls apart from the foundation up. By the time Don Bosco was ordained a priest on June the 5th, 1841, in the chapel of the Archbishop's Seminary in Turin, the industrial city around him was being torn open by the early stages of mass urbanization. The population of Turin had swelled from around 100,000 people in 1820 to nearly 200,000 by 1851. Families from the countryside were pouring into the city looking for factory work. The Shroud of Turin was locked in the royal chapel of the House of Savoy on the Piazza San Giovanni, under glass, already a symbol of a city where the sacred and the grinding machinery of modernity lived in uneasy proximity. Don Bosco set up his first oratory in 1841 in a sacristy on Via Cotolengo. By 1846, the oratory of Valdocco was established in a series of rented and later purchased buildings in the northern quarter of Turin, near what is today the Piazza Maria Ausiliatrice. He worked with abandoned boys, street children, young factory workers, but he also counseled their families. He heard confessions. He talked to mothers and fathers. He sat with married couples in crisis. And over decades of that work, he began to articulate with growing precision what he was seeing destroy marriages in the industrial city of his time. He said this once directly to a group of parents gathered at the oratory in 1864, according to testimony recorded in Volume 7 of the Memorie Biografiche. The greatest enemy of the family is not the man who comes from outside to break it. It is the silence that grows inside it, fed by two people who have forgotten that love is not a feeling that stays by itself. It is a choice made every single morning. Cold, clear, devastating. And what did Don Bosco mean by indifference specifically? He was not talking about the quiet comfort of a couple who has been married 30 years and no longer needs to fill every silence with words. He was talking about something entirely different. He described it in a letter dated March the 3rd, 1872, to a Salesian collaborator working in Genoa named Father Giovanni Caliero, who had written to Don Bosco about a parishioner couple whose marriage had grown visibly cold. Don Bosco wrote back with a list of signs he had learned to recognize. The husband who no longer asks his wife how she feels. the wife who has stopped telling her husband about her fears, the couple who eats together every night but has not had a real conversation in 3 months, the partners who pray separately, or not at all, because the shared prayer died first, the man who comes home and goes directly to another room because the other person's presence has become, to him, just background noise. That is what he meant. Not hatred, not violence. Absence inside presence, the shell of a marriage where the soul used to be. He had a name for what caused it. He called it the progressive dimming of attention, and he believed it happened in stages that were entirely predictable if you knew where to look. The first stage was busyness, justified by necessity. Work, children, money problems, the legitimate pressures of life that caused two people to start functioning as logistical partners rather than as spouses who love each other. Don Bosco understood this stage better than almost any pastoral figure of his century, because he was watching it happen in real time among the factory workers of Turin, men pulling 12-hour shifts in the silk mills on the Via Po and the chemical works near the Po River's northern bank, coming home too exhausted to speak, wives managing households on wages that regularly ran short before the end of the month. He did not judge the exhaustion. He documented it. He said the danger was not the exhaustion itself. The danger was what happened when couples stopped fighting against it, when they accepted the distance as permanent, when they stopped scheduling even one evening a week to sit together and remember who the other person was. The second stage was the normalization of separateness. This is what Don Bosco found most alarming. The couple who had been distant for long enough that they now thought distance was simply how marriage worked. He described one case in detail during a retreat for married couples held at the Oratory of Valdaco in the spring of 1867. He spoke of a woman, unnamed in the record, who had come to confession and told him she felt nothing for her husband anymore. Not hatred, she said, nothing. She could not even remember the last time she had felt genuinely glad to see him. Don Bosco asked her how long this had been going on. She thought about it and said she believed it had started about 4 years after the wedding, roughly in 1858, when their second child was born and her husband had taken on extra shifts at the textile warehouse near Piazza Vittorio Emanuele to pay for the new expenses. She had been waiting since then for things to go back to how they were. They never did. Don Bosco told her something that stopped her cold. He said the feeling did not leave the marriage first. The attention left first. The feeling followed the attention out the door. This was not popular theology. It was pastoral precision honed by decades of watching. And it aligned exactly with the Catholic theology of marriage that Don Bosco had absorbed from St. Francis de Sales and had been transmitting to his young people since the early years of the oratory. De Sales, writing in his introduction to the devout life in 1609, had described marital love as a garden that requires daily tending, where it dies not with a sudden killing frost, but with a slow drying out, week after week, until one morning you look out and everything is brown, and you do not even remember exactly when it changed. Don Bosco inherited that image and sharpened it. He told couples at the oratory that a marriage left to run on its own momentum would always, without exception, drift toward indifference. Not because either person was bad, because gravity, because the world pulls constantly in 100 directions, and the marriage is the one thing that does not pull back unless you make it pull back, unless you choose it actively, daily, on purpose. Silence. Distance. Routine without meaning. He had a particular alarm he would sound when he saw a couple heading into stage 2. He would find a reason to speak to the husband or wife privately and ask a single direct question. Not about their prayer life or their finances or their children's schooling. He would ask, when was the last time you did something kind for your spouse that they were not expecting? Not a duty, not a habit. Something deliberately chosen because you wanted them to feel seen. If the answer was a long pause, Don Bosco knew exactly where that family was heading. There is a documented account from 1873, preserved in the Salesian archive, of a man named Carlo Ferrero, a merchant from the Borgo Po neighborhood of Turin, who had come to the oratory seeking Don Bosco's advice, not about his marriage, but about a business dispute. Don Bosco listened to the business problem, resolved it with a practical suggestion in about 10 minutes, and then looked at the man and asked him, without preamble, whether his wife was well. Carlo said yes, she was fine. Don Bosco asked when he had last told her she was beautiful. Carlo stared at him. Don Bosco said, very quietly, that he had heard the way Carlo had described his wife in passing, with a casualness that was not peace but forgetfulness, and that he had seen that particular kind of forgetfulness before, and that he knew where it led. He told Carlo to go home that evening and to sit with his wife for 1 hour with no purpose, except to listen to her speak about whatever she wished to speak about, and to do this not because it was required of him, but because she was worth 1 hour of his full attention. Carlo Ferrero came back to the oratory 3 weeks later and told Don Bosco that the conversation that evening had been the first real conversation he and his wife had had in over 2 years. He said she had wept. He said he had not expected that because she had seemed fine. Don Bosco told him that seeming fine is one of the things people do when they have given up on being heard. That exchange is not famous. It is not in the popular biographies. It lives in a single handwritten note from Don Bosco's secretary, Father Michel Rua, filed in a bundle of correspondence from 1873 now held in the Salesian Archive in Rome. But it is exactly the kind of moment that makes Don Bosco's pastoral legacy on marriage so precise and so sharp. He was not describing a theological abstraction. He was describing a Wednesday evening in Turin. He was describing a man who forgot to see his wife, and a wife who had learned to pretend that not being seen was bearable. Subscribe if this kind of documented, source-backed history of faith and human life is what you are looking for. Leave a comment with your city. We read every single one. This research goes deep by design, and your support keeps it going. Now, back to what Don Bosco identified as the third and most dangerous stage of marital indifference. He called it substitution. This is the point at which the emotional vacancy inside the marriage gets filled by something else. Not necessarily another person, though he was clear-eyed about that possibility too. More often, it was work, or obsessive involvement with the children at the expense of the marriage itself. Or, in the Catholic culture of 19th century Turin, even excessive piety, a retreat into religious practice so intense that it became a way of avoiding the spouse, a spiritual life used as a wall rather than a bridge. Don Bosco found this last version particularly insidious. He spoke about it directly in a talk given to a group of Catholic laypeople gathered for a retreat at the oratory in October of 1869. He said he had seen, more times than he wished to count, a husband or wife who went to daily mass, received communion regularly, said the rosary every evening, and served on every parish committee available while their spouse sat at home in silence, feeling not married to a devout Catholic but abandoned by one. He said this was one of the most dangerous self-deceptions he had ever witnessed in pastoral life, because the person doing it genuinely believed they were living well, and the holiness of the exterior practice made it almost impossible for them to see that they were using God as an excuse not to love the specific human being God had given them to love. You cannot love your neighbor in the abstract, he said, according to Father Rua's notes from that retreat, and fail the specific neighbor who eats at your table every night. The precision of that line is almost violent. He meant it to be. Don Bosco had seen where substitution leads. He described it in his correspondence with Bishop Lorenzo Gastaldi of Turin in a letter from January 1871 as the point at which the marriage exists only in legal and sacramental form, while the living reality of it has been replaced by two parallel solitudes sharing one address. He wrote that once a couple reached this stage without intervention, without a deliberate and painful recommitment to each other, the marriage rarely recovered its warmth. The legal bond remained. The sacramental grace remained. But the human experience of the marriage had died, and the death had been so gradual that neither person could name the day it happened. He was not fatalistic about it. He believed recovery was always possible while both people were alive and willing. But he was honest about the cost. He told couples who came to him at this stage that rebuilding warmth in a cold marriage required the same courage as starting from nothing, because in many ways that is exactly what it was, starting from nothing with a stranger you had once known and somehow stopped seeing. Don Bosco had a particular method he recommended for couples at this stage. He did not recommend romantic gestures. He did not recommend vacations or special dinners. He recommended confession, first, separately, honestly, because he believed that indifference in a marriage was never entirely innocent, and that both partners carried some responsibility for the distance, even if they had very different ways of contributing to it. Then he recommended what he called the reestablishment of daily attentiveness, by which he meant something almost embarrassingly simple: noticing. Looking at the other person when they spoke, asking one real question per day, not a logistical question about the household, but a question about how the person actually felt about something, sitting together at the end of the day for at least 15 minutes with no task to complete. This sounds trivial. It was not. For the factory workers and merchants and market vendors of Turin in the 1860s and 70s, carving even 15 minutes of intentional togetherness out of a day built around survival was an act of will. Don Bosco knew this. He was not naive about the conditions of life in the industrial city. He was asking people to treat their marriages as worth fighting for, even when the fight was exhausting, especially when the fight was exhausting. There is something worth pausing on here, because this recommendation from Don Bosco, the 15 minutes, the single real question, the deliberate noticing, was given to people living inside one of the most chaotic periods of urban transition in Italian history. Turin in the 1860s was not a calm city. The Risorgimento, the unification of Italy, had made it the first capital of the new Kingdom of Italy in 1861, a role that lasted only until 1865, when the capital was moved to Florence and then to Rome in 1871. In those 4 years, the city was flooded with government workers, politicians, journalists, soldiers, and all the commerce they dragged behind them. The population shifted, prices rose, neighborhoods changed, and the working families of Borgo Po and Porta Palazzo and the streets around the oratory at Valdoco were navigating all of this with no social safety net, no labor protections, and no institutional support for the pressures those changes put on their marriages. Don Bosco knew all of this. He was not asking these people to attend couples therapy. He was asking them to carve 15 minutes out of a life that was trying to grind them to nothing, and to use those 15 minutes to remember that the person sitting across from them at the table was the one person in the world who had promised to carry all of this alongside them. Not to fix it, not to solve it, just to be present for it, together. He also addressed something that almost no pastoral voice of his era addressed directly, the role of small cruelties in building the wall of indifference. Not beatings, not public humiliations, the small ones. The tone of voice that conveys contempt without a single insulting word. The eye roll kept mostly hidden. The way a husband dismisses an idea his wife suggests without quite finishing her sentence. The way a wife responds to her husband's attempt at warmth with a flat, minimal answer that communicates, clearly but deniably, that she has already written him off. Don Bosco called these the little betrayals of the eyes and the voice, and he said they did more damage per unit than almost any single large fight, because a single large fight can be apologized for, confronted, resolved. The little betrayals accumulate in silence. They build a record inside the other person that is never spoken aloud, never given the chance to be answered, never given the chance to heal. They just pile up, year after year, until the other person has a case file that runs 500 pages long and no longer has any interest in opening the book to start over. He described one such accumulation in devastating detail in the spring of 1875, during a private conversation with a woman who had come to the oratory on behalf of her adult daughter. The daughter's marriage, 7 years old, was quietly collapsing. The woman wanted Don Bosco to speak to her son-in-law. Don Bosco listened to the description of the marriage for a long time. Then he asked the mother a single question. He asked whether her daughter had a habit of sighing loudly when her husband entered the room. The mother paused. She admitted that, yes, her daughter had developed this habit. Don Bosco said that the sigh was the problem. Not only the sigh, of course, but the sigh was the symbol of everything that had gone unsaid, and the husband heard it every time, even if he pretended he did not, and every time he heard it, he retreated a little further from the marriage, because no man and no woman can continue to reach towards someone who signals with every breath that his presence is a burden. He told the mother to go home and tell her daughter to confess the sigh. This was Don Bosco's pastoral logic at its most precise. He was not interested in the surface. He was reading the language of bodies and habits and small accumulated gestures, and he was naming what he saw with complete directness, because he believed that naming it clearly was the first step toward changing it. Rough, exact, merciful only after the truth was already on the table. Now let's be clear about the theological weight behind all of this, because Don Bosco was not simply a very insightful marriage counselor. He was a priest operating out of a specific and rigorous understanding of what Christian marriage actually is. In Catholic theology, marriage is a sacrament. This means it is not simply a legal contract or a social institution. It is a sign, living and visible in the world, of the love of Christ for his church. This is drawn directly from St. Paul's letter to the Ephesians, chapter 5, verses 25 through 32, and it is the foundation upon which the entire Catholic theology of marriage rests. The love between husband and wife is not merely analogous to the love of Christ for the church. It is meant to be an actual participation in it, an embodiment of it, a place where that love becomes visible and tangible in the daily life of two specific people. Don Bosco understood this with complete seriousness. When he said that indifference rots a marriage from the inside out, he was not making a sociological observation. He was saying that indifference is a betrayal of a sacrament. It is the refusal, chosen gradually and daily, to embody the love that the sacrament exists to manifest. And because the sacrament is not merely a private matter between two people, but a sign given to the church and to the world, the rot of indifference does not stay contained inside the marriage. It spreads to the children who learn what love looks like from watching their parents. It spreads to the neighborhood, to the parish, to the next generation of marriages built by people who were raised inside a cold one. Don Bosco documented this inheritance of coldness with particular urgency in the context of the boys he worked with at the oratory of Valdoco. He noted, in letters and in pastoral notes recorded by Father Lemoyne, that the boys most likely to end up on the street, most likely to get into serious trouble, most likely to arrive at the oratory already broken in ways that were very hard to repair, were almost never boys who came from families destroyed by a single dramatic catastrophe. They were boys who came from families where nothing dramatic had ever happened, where the father had never beaten anyone, where the mother had never abandoned anyone, where the household was simply, permanently, quietly cold. where love had been present once and then had stopped being actively chosen and had slowly drained away until the family was running on habit and obligation and nothing else. He called these boys the children of the slow silence. And he said they were. In his pastoral experience at the oratory between 1841 and the last years of his active ministry in the early 1880s, the most wounded children he ever met, because they carried a grief they could not name and an emptiness they could not explain and a longing for warmth that they had never been taught to ask for. Empty, cold, inherited. Don Bosco's final years were spent largely at Valdoco and in Rome, working to secure formal approval for the Salesian congregation he had founded, which received its definitive approval from Pope Pius IX in 1874. He died on January the 31st, 1888 in Turin. He was canonized by Pope Pius XI on Easter Sunday, April the 1st, 1934. At the time of his canonization, the Salesian congregation he had founded operated in over 600 houses across 30 countries, working primarily with young people in poverty. His cause had been built on his work with children. But the testimonies gathered during the beatification process in 1929, held under the supervision of Cardinal Gaetano Bisletti at the Sacred Congregation for Rights in Rome, included dozens of accounts from married couples and their families who credited Don Bosco's pastoral intervention, often a single conversation, with saving their marriages from the specific rot he had spent his life diagnosing. One testimony stands out in the beatification archive. It was submitted by a woman named Giuseppina Ferrero, no relation to Carlo Ferrero mentioned earlier, from the Crocetta neighborhood of Turin. She was 81 years old at the time of her testimony in 1929. She described a visit her parents had made to Don Bosco at the oratory of Valdoco sometime around 1875, when she had been approximately 27 years old. Her parents had been married for 31 years at that point. They had not, she said, spoken about anything personal in at least 15 years. They lived in the same apartment on Via Nisa. They raised their children together. They attended the same Sunday Mass at the Church of San Salvario, and they had not touched each other with affection in so long that she could not remember ever having seen them embrace. The marriage was not unhappy in the loud sense. It was simply gone. Her father had gone to see Don Bosco expecting to speak about a matter involving one of the boys at the oratory. Don Bosco spoke to him for a while about that matter. Then, as the conversation was ending, Don Bosco asked him something that nobody had ever asked him in 31 years of marriage. He asked, "Do you still know what makes her laugh?" The man had no answer. He stood there in the courtyard of the oratory of Valdoco, in front of a 60-year-old priest with a white beard and a reputation for speaking to the dead, and he could not answer a question about the woman he had been married to for 3 decades. Don Bosco told him to find out, not by asking her directly, which would have felt strange after so many years of silence, by watching, by paying attention, by going back to the same quality of noticing he had given her when they were first together. He told him that love, even love that has gone nearly silent, does not require reinvention. It requires remembering, and that the act of remembering, deliberate and humble, is itself already the beginning of return. Giuseppina Ferrero testified in 1929 that her parents had, in the remaining 12 years before her mother died in 1887, recovered something she had never seen in her entire childhood. She described it carefully. She said it was not romantic in the way young people imagine. It was warmer and quieter than that. It was 2 old people who had found each other again, after a very long time of being lost in the same house. Her father had outlived her mother by 9 years. He died in 1896. Giuseppina said that in the last years of his life he spoke about his wife constantly. He carried her photograph, taken at a studio on Via Po in the early 1880s, in his coat pocket until the day he died. Don Bosco was not in the room for any of that. He had asked one question in a courtyard in 1875 and then walked away. He had no idea what followed. He died in 1888 not knowing. The photograph in the pocket, the recovered warmth, the old woman's testimony in 1929, the extraordinary ordinary outcome of one specific act of pastoral attentiveness in a Turin courtyard. None of it appeared in any document he ever saw. But here is what the Beatification Archive shows, and what Pietro Stella's research in the 1960s confirmed by cross-referencing testimony against Salesian internal correspondence. Don Bosco repeated this pattern. The single direct question aimed precisely at the specific wound, more times than can be fully counted across his 47 years of active ministry. He asked a man whether he still knew what made his wife laugh. He asked a woman whether she still prayed for her husband by name. He asked a husband whether he knew the color of his wife's eyes without looking. He asked a wife whether she could describe, in any detail at all, how her husband spent the 3 hours before he came home. These were not spiritual exercises drawn from a manual. They were his own pastoral invention, refined over decades of listening to marriages describe themselves to him from the inside, and they were aimed at the same target every time. The specific moment when 2 people stopped seeing each other and started existing alongside each other instead. That moment, that exact point of departure. He believed it could almost always be located. He believed it almost always had a specific shape, a specific habit, a specific choice that had been made or not made at a specific time, and then repeated until it hardened into a wall. And he believed that because it had been built piece by piece, it could be dismantled piece by piece, if both people were willing, if both people were honest, if both people were willing to be embarrassed by what they found when they looked at how far they had drifted and what they had done, quietly and without intending it, to help the drift along. This is the thing that made Don Bosco's pastoral work on marriage different from almost everything else being said from Catholic pulpits in the second half of the 19th century. Most pastoral guidance on marriage at that time focused on duties. Fulfill your duties as a spouse, provide for your family, raise your children in the faith, observe the commandments. These are not wrong things to say. But Don Bosco understood, with a clarity that seems almost modern in its sharpness, that a marriage can fulfill every external duty and still be quietly dead inside. That you can provide for your family and still be a stranger to your wife. That you can raise your children in the faith and still be raising them inside a coldness that will shape how they love for the rest of their lives. That you can observe every commandment and still fail, slowly and systematically, and without dramatic incident, the one person you stood before God and promised to love. He saw this. He named it. He refused to pretend it was acceptable just because it was quiet. There's a final document worth holding on to. It is a short note, barely half a page, written by Don Bosco to a married couple whose names have been redacted in the archive, sometime in the early 1880s, believed by Father Eugenio Curia, who cataloged the correspondence, to date from approximately 1882 or 1883, roughly 5 years before Don Bosco's death. By this point, Don Bosco was aging visibly, frequently unwell, his voice sometimes failing him, his travels limited by the deterioration of his health. But the note is characteristically precise. He wrote to the couple that he had been thinking about them and praying for them, and that he wanted to say something he had perhaps not said plainly enough when they had spoken in person. He wrote, "Every day you do not choose each other is a day the distance grows, and the distance, if you let it grow long enough, becomes the whole of the marriage." That note is filed in folder 63 of the Salesian Archive's Pastoral Correspondence section in Rome, inside a bundle labeled Marriages and Families, dating roughly from 1870 to 1884. It was never published in any popular collection of Don Bosco's writings. It was never quoted in a sermon. It sat in a box in a Rome archive for over a century, known only to the scholars like Pietro Stella, who spent years moving through those folders, looking for what Don Bosco actually said, in the ordinary language of ordinary conversations, to the ordinary people of Turin who came to him with the quiet wreckage of their lives. The woman who received that note died in Turin in 1911. The man died in 1904. What happened to their marriage after the note, whether they chose each other again or continued to drift, is not recorded anywhere in any document that has survived. The archive has no follow-up, no testimony, no outcome, just the note, the distance, and the choice that was still, until the last possible moment, available to be made.